Hi, I'm Fareed Zakaria. Education has never been more important to America's future. Supporting children's early development is the most important long-term investment we can make. And the best way to do that is to work with their parents. It is the educational levels of the parents, their ability to read and write and speak English, that has the most profound impact on their children's academic performance. Literacy Partners offers low-income and immigrant parents in New York City intensive free classes to help them build the skills they need to achieve success in today's world. It promotes a child's early development and school readiness. This is job training for the most important job there is, the job of parenting. It is a solution that works. According to the Best Plus test developed by the Center for Applied Linguistics, nearly 80% of the adult students gain at least one academic level and achieve their goals during the year. According to the surveys and reading logs that students themselves keep, parents increase the time they spend reading with children. That's the single best way to promote a child's early language development, and it rises by 40%.
When he sees me read at night, then he will take up his book and he will read also.
Not only that, according to the Head Start developmental assessments, the children of Literacy Partners students showed a minimum of 67% more progress on their early academic assessments than their peers in the same preschool. I've seen many efforts to break cycles of poverty, and I am impressed by the results this small organization achieves. I hope you'll join me in supporting Literacy Partners by visiting its website, www.literacypartners.org. Thank you and enjoy the flight.
Immediate action required. Leave color en route area for a maximum of 30 minutes. Dining room, kitchen, microwave room. Keep out of reach of children. Take 2 tablets orally every 5 hours as needed. Do not exceed 6 tablets daily. Thank you.
When parents can't read, children can't just be children. Literacy Partners is taking action, teaching parents to read. Parents like me.
Welcome. Tonight's program was originally broadcast in the fall of 2020, before the presidential election, before COVID-19 vaccines were readily available, and before the political hysteria over critical race theory. But the conversation held over a year ago is still as relevant today. We hope you enjoy the program.
Good evening. I'm Darren Walker of the Ford Foundation, and I am delighted to be the moderator for this evening's event. On this occasion, we celebrate Literacy Partners and the Champion of Literacy Award winner, a remarkable, extraordinary initiative called the 1619 Project. It is a brainchild of a remarkable, inimitable journalist. Her name is Nikole Hannah-Jones, and we will hear from her later this evening. But first, let me introduce Jake Silverstein, the editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine.
Thank you, Darren. I'm thrilled to be here tonight with Literacy Partners to celebrate the work of the 1619 Project and its Pulitzer Prize-winning creator, Nikole Hannah-Jones. By now, I think everybody knows about the story of the 1619 Project. It's a project that Nicole conceived to mark the 400th anniversary of the moment in August of 1619 when a ship arrived near Point Comfort in the English colony of Virginia, bearing a cargo of enslaved Africans. These people were the first enslaved Africans brought to the English colonies that would become the United States, and their arrival marks the beginning of American slavery. Nicole's vision was simple but powerful, that this year of 1619 marked the beginning of not just American slavery, but of the American story. A story about racism and inequality, to be sure, but also a story in which the struggle for Black liberation has played a central, heroic, and defining role. Nicole's vision was that 1619, as much as the much better known year of 1776, should be considered a foundational date in this country, that people should know that year, and they should know what it stands for. This vision animated an ambitious special project from the New York Times Magazine consisting of a special issue, a special broadsheet section, a 6-part audio series, and an educational curriculum developed by our partners at the Pulitzer Center. The magazine issue contained a series of historical essays. Each of them showed how phenomenon in contemporary American life can be traced back to slavery, to the anti-Black racism that it spawned, and to the struggle to resist it. These essays unsettled dominant narratives about our past that have prevented us from understanding and coming to terms with our own history. Nicole was the creative genius behind this project. Not only did she conceive of it and lead it, she wrote the main essay, which quickly became one of the most widely read articles that the New York Times Magazine has ever published. It also went on to win a Pulitzer Prize for feature writing. Today, more than a year later, we are so proud of the impact that Nicole's vision has had on the world. We're in the process of developing the magazine issue into a book with Penguin Random House, and we're working on film and television adaptations as well. And meanwhile, the curriculum that was developed based on the 1619 Project is being used in more than 4,000 classrooms in all 50 states. The 1619 Project has had a huge impact, and it has also sparked furious response. This was, of course, entirely predictable. We always knew that an effort like this one, intended to upend and correct established narratives, would meet with resistance. When you're challenging dominant beliefs, prejudices, and mythologies, you're sure to be met with resentment. But even though it was predictable, it's not always so easy to withstand. So I want to take a moment to salute Nicole for her courage under fire. It's absolutely grueling to be under the kind of continuous barrage of attacks that Nicole has been subjected to over the past year. She's had to fight day after day to clear space for these truths to be heard. She's had to endure unimaginable threats, racism, lies, and distortions. That she has survived all of this to bring a great truth into the world, to make this year of 1619 ring out as it should, makes her truly a champion. Now, great journalism like this, it doesn't just happen. It takes great leaders, leaders who invest time and money in projects that matter, leaders who cultivate, support, and defend great journalists. Without those leaders, those of us down in the trenches doing the work don't have a North Star to orient us. We don't have the confidence to know that our work will be defended when we piss people off, especially powerful people. So it is no surprise that the 1619 Project was created at the New York Times under the leadership of Arthur Sulzberger Jr., truly one of the great journalism leaders of our time. It's been one of the honors of my life to work at the Times during Arthur's tenure. He's inspired me, he's protected me and my journalists, and he's made so much work like the 1619 Project possible. So I'm pleased to introduce the chairman of the New York Times, who will present the Champion of Literacy Award to my colleague, Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Thank you for that warm introduction, Jake. And more importantly, thank you for your tremendous stewardship of the New York Times Magazine. The fact that we are here tonight is in part a testament to your bold leadership and your incredible eye for talent. I'm speaking, of course, about Nikole Hannah-Jones, the intellectual and creative force, MacArthur would say genius, behind the 1619 Project, a remarkable, groundbreaking piece of journalism crafted and conceived by an equally remarkable and groundbreaking journalist. One whose passionate and an unflinching pursuit of the truth has deepened our understanding of slavery's sweeping legacy on the United States of America. The 1619 Project is something that everyone should read, but for far too many of our fellow New Yorkers, the written word stands as a barrier to their education and to their participation in our democracy. This affects us all. An informed citizenry is vital to a functioning democracy, and the best way to secure that outcome is to ensure every citizen has the ability to read and to write. Fortunately, Literacy Partners has dedicated itself to this critical cause. The New York Times has been proud to support Literacy Partners' work through the Neediest Cases Fund, an effort that has raised awareness and over $300 million for causes like adult literacy since the fund's inception in 1911. But we are here tonight to talk about another year in our nation's history, 1619, and to recognize the person whose work has placed 1619 at the center of our national conversation. It is my honor to introduce the recipient of this year's coveted Champion of Literacy Award, a writer whose work embodies the best traditions of our country and of the New York Times, Nikole Hannah-Jones.
Thank you so much, and thank you to Literacy Partners for this tremendous honor. Black people were the only people in America for whom it was ever illegal to read. It was because the white people who enslaved Black Americans understood that literacy led to liberation. If enslaved people were literate, they were able to write passes for freedom. They were able to read the revolutionary texts that said that men and women were born with inalienable rights. They were able to find out that there was an entire abolitionist movement led often by other Black Americans who had gotten free that were calling for their liberation. And so there were laws all across the South preventing Black people who were enslaved and sometimes even those who were free from being able to learn what for many people was a basic right. But Black people have always fought for literacy. At times they stole their education, even when it was illegal, even when being caught reading or teaching to read could lead to physical punishment, torture, and even death. They still fought to find ways to become literate. Some of them put together their pennies and purchased the Webster's Blue Book Primer so that they could teach themselves in the few hours each night that they had on their own. Some of them founded secret schools in churches or held in the slave cabins. Some of them dug pits in the forest. And on Sundays, the one day that they had some time to themselves, they would go into the forest and they would go into the pit and they would hold these freedom schools. Others would eavesdrop on the white children that they were to serve as their children were being tutored, and they would learn literacy that way. Yet even despite all of these efforts, 98% of the enslaved could not read at the moment of emancipation. And so one of the first things that Black people did at the end of slavery was they took the tiny amount of money that they managed to obtain and they built schools. And they built schools for themselves. And you would see Black people, children, going to schools, but also parents, once they worked all day in the fields, would come into the schools. And there are even stories of 80-year-old and 90-year-olds who just wanted to learn to read so they could read the Bible for themselves once before they died. But even these attempts at self-education were thwarted. And you have stories of all across the South and even in the Northeast of Black schools being burnt down, of teachers being whipped, of students and parents who dared to seek an education being punished for that. Because there was an understanding even after slavery that you could not keep a population exploited if that population was educated. And then Black people, when they were finally allowed to obtain an education, were shoveled into segregated schools. And oftentimes, even though Black people were paying tax dollars for these schools, white schools were funded at 30 to 40 times higher rate than the schools for Black children. Basically, there has never been a period of time in the history of this country where Black children have received an equal education to that of white children. And even today, schools that serve Black and brown children receive billions of dollars less in funding than schools that educate a majority white population. So the struggle for literacy for Black Americans in particular has been a generational struggle. And it is the work of literacy partners is really trying to address that legacy of slavery. We don't often talk about the struggle for literacy and the gaping opportunity gap as being a legacy of slavery, but it is. And that's really what, at its heart, the 1619 Project tried to accomplish. It tried to show that we have not dealt with this past and that so much about modern American life can still be connected back to the legacy of slavery. That's why I'm so honored to receive this award on behalf of the 1619 Project. This project was intended to honor the resilience, the resolve, and the struggle of Black Americans, to force an acknowledgement of the continuing legacy of slavery, and to understand that education has always been a big part of what this project was trying to do. We, through this project, were trying to obtain for Americans a different type of literacy, a historical literacy, a racial literacy, a literacy that actually allows us to confront who we really are as a country so that we can become something else. Without this type of literacy that you find in the 1619 Project and all types of historical and sociological works that social scientists and scholars have been doing for decades, we don't have an ability to truly understand the country that we're in right now. So I feel that this work is very much a partnership with the work of the Literacy Partnership. It is of the same type of drive, which is to understand that it is education that leads to liberation, and it's education that remains a primary driver of inequality. And I can't be more grateful for this recognition, but also for the work that the Literacy Partners do. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nicole, for your profound prophetic remarks about the work of Literacy Partners and its connection to the 1619 Project. You have made an indelible contribution, not only to scholarship and culture, but to how we think about the founding of this nation and how we must go forward. And so tonight is really about connecting the mission of the literacy partners and your work which rightly won a Pulitzer, a recognition in the field of journalism that is rare. And I know that I speak for everyone who is a part of Literacy Partners in saying congratulations to you. You have made a monumental contribution to our nation. I'm going to bring in someone you and I know and respect a lot. Her name is Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw. And she too is someone like you who changed the way we think. I remember reading the first critical race theory article. I was trained as a lawyer. I went to law school, but I never understood jurisprudence the same way after I read the critical race theory paper. So I'm delighted to welcome Kim with us and looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you, Darren. I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. And Nicole, congratulations, well-deserved recognition for changing the national conversation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
I just want to start with you first, Nicole, and then Kim. Nicole, did you, when you embarked on the 1619 project, did you think that you might actually have the impact that you have had? Did you think that you would change the way we understand the founding of this nation?
So thank you, Darren. And I'll answer that question in a second. But first, I just need to show some appreciation to my sis, Kim, there. Much like you, Darren, when I first read critical race theory, it was like all of the pieces that had been in my mind were connected in a way that it was like the most natural thing in the world, but I'd never seen it spelled out that way. So, you've just so profoundly shaped my own thinking and people who have tried to detract from our work in recent weeks try to use critical race theory as a slur, but I proudly say the critical race theory helped shape my thinking as a journalist and the 1619 project. And so I owe such a great debt to your scholarship. So just thank you. As for your question, Darren, absolutely not. You would have to have some crazy amount of hubris to expect that you would produce something that would ultimately have the impact the 1619 project had. Actually, right before it published, I had a great, almost paralyzing anxiety that I would have somehow gotten the Times to support this project and put all these resources to this project, and it was going to publish and nobody was going to care, and that I'd never get them to do and support anything like this again. So I absolutely had no idea. What I did know was that we had been unflinching, that we had been uncompromising in the work that we wanted to produce, that we had some of the most brilliant Black minds who were taking part of it. I knew we had produced something that was powerful, but as you all know, the quality of the work doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to go into the world and get kind of widespread recognition or that people will take it in. So there was a moment right before we published when Jake Silverstein asked, what's your ultimate, like your biggest ambition for the project, if your pipe dream for the project? And I said simply, I want Americans to know the date 1619. And it seemed ridiculous that, you could produce a work of journalism that could kind of force a date into the national lexicon, but somehow that has happened. And even Trump supporters who, say they hate the project, I don't know if they've read it or not, they also know the date 1619. And that's a powerful thing. So no, but the short of it is not at all.
Well, Kim, when did you first hear about the project, and when you read it, when you actually got your copy of the magazine? At least for me, I needed to tactically fill it.
Yes.
What did you
Yes.
think? What did you think?
You had to go out and get it, you know,
Yes,
and I
exactly.
bought like 5 newspapers, so I knew that I would have them across all of the places that I travel. I remember I heard that it was coming, you know, at first, and I was, first of all, honestly astonished that this was coming out in the paper of record. I wouldn't have been surprised if it had come out in some of the presses that I knew, but I was astonished and excited about it. When I finally got my hands on it, my first thought was, okay, how many of these articles am I going to be able to use in my civil rights class? Because the first quarter of my civil rights class is basically retelling the story of how the Constitution came about. And that is challenging work to do anywhere, but especially in a law school. And I'll tell you why. When I first started teaching, one of the biggest controversies that had happened in law teaching was Derek Bell, who, you know, was an icon to a whole generation of race law scholars, had been teaching in a visiting position at a law school that I won't name. And in his constitutional law course, he started the course with the establishment of slavery. So slavery comes first, and then the Constitution comes in. And that is a way of telling the story in which you understand that the Constitution was largely created to facilitate slavery, not to fight against it. And that's a fundamentally different baseline from which to talk about law, right? And it's a different baseline from which to talk about the 13th Amendment and the 14th Amendment. It's sort of like we're starting over again. Well, because he chose to teach it that way, students petitioned against him, and the faculty and the dean in this law school decided that they were going to have to teach an alternative course in constitutional law, and didn't tell him the reason they were doing it was because there were complaints about the way he was telling the story of the Constitution. Now, that was in 1986, 1987, but things really hadn't changed that much until now. So when the paper of record basically says it is legitimate to start telling the story of this republic, not at the moment that the Constitution was created, but based on the distribution of property, the preferences, the institutions that were in place at that point, that is a sea change. Not just for lay people, but for all of us who are basically teaching a new generation about how to think about the country that we've inherited. So I was clicking my heels, and the fact that, as Nicole, you said, whether you are a critic or not, you cannot unlearn 1619. It means that now the debate is about that. And to that very important extent, it doesn't matter what the new 1776 commission is going to do. You have changed the conversation. You've inserted something that people will have to grapple with.
And I can see that both of you are in sisterhood in part because you're both brilliant, but you also have both radically disrupted normative thinking and years of historical construction. So talk about, Nicole, starting with you. Both of you experienced tremendous challenges because you were putting into the marketplace of ideas that challenged the status quo. And talk about that as two Black women, both award-winning, both coming in with no apologies for your brilliance and asserting yourselves into this marketplace of ideas. It has not been without pain.
I'm I mean, I don't know what you want me to add to that. That would be correct. You know, the thing is though, when you are a Black woman of a certain tradition, you have been fortified for this. If you studied other Black women who came before us, then you already knew what to expect. It doesn't mean that it's not stressful and that it doesn't hurt and that it's not exhausting, but it's almost as if there was not the pushback, I would not have succeeded, because that would have meant I was telling a comforting story. It would have meant I was telling a story that had already been told before. And when you want to challenge existing narratives, especially in a country where from our first breath, we are drenched in this idea of exceptionalism and this idea that we were the freest, most liberatory, best country in the world. Black people have always known a different side of that story. So it's been fascinating to see the response and the pushback and the duration of the pushback, because I actually didn't think I was telling that radical of a story, frankly. And as you know, Kim, this is all relying on, and as you know, Darren, this is all relying on scholarship that has been ongoing for decades. You know, David Blight, who no one would call a radical, said that anti-Blackness is in the DNA of this country, right? I mean, these are not radical, but I think what is, as you said, it's in the paper of record. People were not expecting to see a popular history in the paper of record that turns this idea of American exceptionalism on its head and actually says Black people are the most exceptional thing that this country has produced. And it was who it was produced by. I certainly think a lot of the ire is because who I am as a Black woman. You've seen again and again people saying I wasn't humble enough. I didn't give enough deference to historians who didn't even write about slavery. So it's all of those things, but I'm not bothered by it. It was just expected. And I can tell you again and again through the months, it has constantly been other Black women who have reached out, who have made sure I was okay, who have held me up. And I just see it as a proud part of a tradition in this country.
Okay, other Black woman who has held her up. What do you have to say?
You know, I mean, Nicole hit every point of it. You know, a lot of the ideas that you know, we have integrated into the work have been there. But I do think that the idea, you know, the nerve that we Black women are talking back to dominant narratives, that, you know, we actually have the you know, the gall really to, you know, say, you know, all this stuff that you guys talk about, that you celebrate, that you attempt to whitewash. We're not having it, and here's why. I think it would be edgy when it is spoken by people of a different race and, frankly, of a different gender. It's independent thought. It's really forcing us to think. And I think that the role of Black women in society has rarely been understood by the dominant culture as the people that force us to think. Largely because the things that we have produced have either been taken over by someone else or dismissed. I think about Ida B. Wells, for example, who is the author of the anti-lynching campaign.
Absolutely.
Right? And the ways that she talked about it and the courage that you know, she performed in actually going to these places and educating and finding out, educating herself and telling the public what the truth is. It was just too hard to hear that, you know, from a Black woman. And she never got the recognition and, frankly, the support that she was due. And even when her campaign ended up being such an important part of our anti-racist history, it was only when other people actually took it over. Right. So this has been, you know, our history. I think that the one thing that is different about, this moment is that there is a far more direct connection between those of us who are doing this work and the public who's receiving it. So the ability to just take us out of the things that we do isn't as great as it might have been in the past. And as Nicole said, there's a fierce collection, of Black women out there who do have our back and are willing to step into the fire, with us, recognizing that it's not about us as individuals, it's about us as a people and us as a nation. And for us to be able to continue to tell these stories is important for the futures that obviously we want to imagine a different future than the one that we're set on, right now.
Yeah, because Ida B. Wells didn't have a Kim Crenshaw. She didn't have a cohort of sisterhood who were powerful sisters. Kim, you and Nicole both talk about collective memory. Nicole, I want you to talk about this idea of collective memory and how it works into the 1619 Project.
Yeah, I mean, in the end, that's what the 1619 Project is. It is challenging our national memory. It is forcing us to ask and question, how do we come to know the stories that we know, and how do we come to believe the things that we believe, and that those were intentional decisions that have to leave out an awful lot of the story. And I've always said that Black people are the most inconvenient aspect of the American narrative, because for every story we want to tell to glorify this country, Black people are over there off in the corner saying, hold up a second, that's not quite right. And we've been told that we have to suppress those stories. We have to not talk about that Virginia was the most wealthiest and most powerful of the 13 colonies, that it was an enslaver who drafted the Declaration. It was an enslaver who was the father of the Constitution, the father of the Bill of Rights, the first president of the United States. We have been told that we have to just kind of ignore that. That's an intentional decision. These are not about facts, as critics have said. It's about the shaping of a national identity.
The question that you and Kim are dealing with in some ways is the erasure of Blackness from that historical narrative. I'm reminded of the first time I visited Monticello, and they explained that at some point, the Monticello Society, as they were preparing to make it a public monument, raised the entire area where the slave quarters were. The little Mulberry Row, they called it, was raised. And it, to me, represented a form of erasure. They wanted people to come to Monticello, but it was as if they wanted to erase Black people, the people who made Monticello possible.
Yes.
That they literally raised us.
But you have to do that, right? It's the only way that the national narrative makes sense, is you have to erase that. I literally, there was a guy arguing on Twitter with the official Monticello Twitter account, because I tweeted that if you go to the back of Monticello, you can see the fingerprints of the enslaved children who made the bricks. And the man was like, that's not true. Enslaved children weren't working on this plantation. And the Twitter account of Monticello gets on and says, yes, that's actually true. Here's the picture. And he told them they were lying. So that tells you, right, the investment that we have made. And the difference is, when you think about a place like Nazi Germany, they can erase Nazism because Nazism was a small period in a country that had already existed for centuries. We can't erase slavery because we were founded in it, and our founders were deeply embedded in it. So to purge that history, we have to purge our foundation. And that's what makes it so challenging. So instead, we just have to erase. And it's a physical erasing, and it's a psychic erasing. And that's what we're getting. That's the pushback against our work.
And
just to build, Kim, what do you say on this from the legal scholar perspective?
Yeah, so I mean, so much erasure in the basic analysis of how deeply slavery was infused in our legal order. You know, I tell my students a lot of times, let's think about what it means to say that slavery was the baseline for the legal order. What that means is something like this. If a slave ran away and was recaptured, the thing that the slave is guilty of is theft.
Yes.
Stealing herself away, right?
Yes.
That I mean, that's why that whole spiritual was steal away to Jesus when the Underground Railroad captain was coming to take people away. But what that tells us is that when the law and slavery are effectively integrated into the foundation, the effort to remove it can't simply be a superficial one. You've got to go down to the actual foundation, the structure, the way that, for example, let's say that slave was able to get away and find their way into the North. The Constitution gave the slaveholder the right to actually demand the return of that slave and potentially anybody else who might look like that slave, who might have been thought to be mistaken for the slave. And states' rights, that is much ballyhooed, didn't really help the northern states protect the African descendant people who were claimed to be, slaves from the South. So the entire structure was built on this idea. So fixing it isn't just about, okay, we're going to, add a little, shush to it. You got to really take it apart and build it up from ground up. So some part of the erasure that you're talking about, Darren, is what allows that demand not to be expressed. It's what allows this whole thing to be whitewashed and for people to feel good about it. And I'll tell you the most important thing that came to my mind when you all were talking about Monticello. Listen, it's not Black people itself that's erased, but how those Black people came to be. Because the real thing that's erased here is Sally Hemings. The real thing that's erased here is, 1790, there were like 700,000 slaves. By the Civil War, there were 4 million plus. How did that happen? Because the end of the importation of the slaves was 1808. So slavery became its own self-perpetuating marketplace. And how do you reproduce it? You reproduce it by the industrialized rape and abuse of Black women. That's a part of history that's completely erased, right? We don't talk about it. And consequently, we don't talk about what the contemporary dimensions of that are right now. The way in which Black women's sexual autonomy is subject to stereotype, the way that Black women's ability to parent their own families is subject to, analysis of pathology, the way in which being safe in our own homes isn't an expectation that anyone has a right to have enforced. So yes, Dred Scott was singularly illustrative of the idea that Black people have no rights that whites are bound to respect. Black women's history tells us that Black women still don't have rights that the police are bound to respect. So these are the erasures that allow these things to go on uninterrupted. I think it's why we have a president who said, we cannot teach this stuff, because in the same way you don't want slaves to be able to read, you don't want other people to be able to learn this stuff. Once you learn this stuff, you don't look at the society in the same way ever again.
Absolutely.
So now we understand why Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw's course is always oversubscribed. So let us go to questions. We have a few questions from folks who would love to hear from both of you. And the first question is from Tanya.
Thank you so much. It's such an honor to be listening in on this conversation. It's thrilling. And, a little bit alluding to some of the trauma that you were speaking with in terms of the experiences of Black women. On a personal level, I would love to know whether either of you have a mental, physical, and spiritual practice that enables you to balance the work that you're doing along with self-care. How do you do it?
Nicole, you want to take that one?
I mean, no. I have.
Come on, Nicole.
I get that question all the time.
All the time, right?
I don't have a good answer. I haven't learned it. It's only been very recently that I've been able to accept that that it's not indulgent to think about such things. It always felt like, when you study history and you understand what our ancestors have been through, that I'm, able to get paid to write for a living at the New York Times. It felt very indulgent to be like, oh, this is so hard. I need to figure out self-care. But with that said, the 1619 Project damn near killed me. Physically, mentally, it was a very difficult year. I was definitely drinking too much, eating too much, very stressed. And a very dear friend of mine pulled me aside one day and said, Nicole, you cannot do this work if you're not here. So I know you don't feel like you need to figure out how to take care of yourself, but if you work yourself to death, if you let this work kill you, then they win and you can't do this work. So.
Black women have often not felt entitled to the idea of nourishing themselves and their bodies and their minds and their spirits. You've earned the right to do that. And I think Tanya probably agrees with me. So we're going to go to the next question. And this is from Davika. Davika, you're up.
Hi, so I'm an educator. I work up in Harlem at a elementary school. And as an educator, I'm interested in what you guys have found works best when trying to reach audiences that aren't naturally seeking to rethink their worldview, whether it's because of opposition, apathy, pessimism. How have you guys in each of your respective fields found that you get people to listen that aren't already listening without softening the truth?
You can go first this time.
Okay. I was thinking, what's my answer to that? Because it's, honestly, there for me, there's no formula. Often it's hit or miss. Mm-hmm. But because I teach in a law school classroom, and we can kind of do whatever we want, I often put students in the position of having to occupy the contradiction. And see how they work their way out of it in order to confront the tension. So, for example, we start the class with an exercise where I'll say, all right, we're going to have a debate. We are reconstituting ourselves as Congress, and we're going to debate reparations for centuries of slavery, and you start and let's see what happens. And so, the side that's against will really make the strong case that, we don't have anything to do with slavery. We weren't even here. We didn't benefit from it. Not our responsibility. And then I'll stop. I say, okay, we're going to change the proposition then. So what we're going to talk about is, okay, we are going to celebrate. We recognize July the 4th is a really complicated holiday. So we're not going to celebrate July 4th anymore. We're going to celebrate Juneteenth. It's got its own complications, but that's the moment of freedom. All right, argue that. And the argument's completely flipped. At that point, it's like, well, that's our heritage. Right. That's where we come from. How can we give up this legacy? And I was like, okay, so how do both of these ideas exist in the same conceptual plane? How do you make sense of, on one hand, not wanting to own the aspects of our history that created the aspects of the history that you want to celebrate? Mm-hmm. And that then becomes the conversation on the first day. So many times people come out of that, at least, as we were saying with Nicole earlier, they at least have to grapple with the contradiction. And if you can get people to see it and grapple with it, then that becomes a conceptual sort of apparatus onto which other information, can be packed into it.
That's a great answer. I mean, I'm a storyteller, so I am always trying to, I mean, as a journalist in general, you don't want to tell people a story that they already know. People don't want to read stories that they already know. So I'm always trying to find what is the novel way to get into it. What is a way that you can disarm the reader so that they'll actually have enough curiosity to read something that they wouldn't ordinarily read. Honestly, much of my work are the people who think that they're on my side, but actually aren't. So for instance, when I did the piece on choosing a school for my daughter in a segregated city, that piece was written to white liberals who say they believe in equality, but maintain segregation. So how do you, they come into it thinking the story is about to be one thing, and then it actually is something else. And the way that I tried to do that with the 1619 Project was every piece that I selected for it had to be surprising. I didn't want to write about the modern legacy of slavery in ways that everyone already knows. That's one of the reasons, as much as I write about education, the education is not in that piece. I think it's not shocking to people that our systems of education have a legacy in slavery. But to take on democracy, to take on capitalism, to say this is why we have traffic in cities, to talk about sugar, we were trying to do things that were very surprising so that you would want to actually read, because you're like, what the hell does traffic have to do with slavery? And then even in my own essay, I start with the American flag and my dad's patriotism. That was a way to connect to white readers who immediately saw that flag and felt disarmed. And then, of course, I'm going to go down and once I get you in, I'm hoping to destroy everything that you ever believed. But I'm giving you an entry point that can disarm you, and I think that's been the way that I've tried to do it. And as you said, Kimberly, like sometimes it's successful, sometimes it isn't. I think we're all trying to figure out what works, and you just never really know. But those are the tools I use. Thank you for your question. Thank you for teaching our children.
Yeah.
So we've got about 5 minutes and we've got 2 questioners. Okay. First is Adriana.
Thank you for this opportunity. I wanted to ask about the 1619 Project curriculum, and you both mentioned threats to teaching the curriculum in schools. And I wonder what you envision is the way forward, how to enact widespread adoption of the 1619 curriculum.
Yeah, I can just say briefly, educators don't like being told what to do by the federal government and how they're going to teach in their classrooms. So the more Trump has tried to talk about punishing school districts, I found that educators have become more resolved to teach it. So there's actually a law that prevents the federal government from dictating local curricula. As many things, he can't actually enforce it. But I haven't found any educators, any school systems that have been afraid to teach the project because of what is happening at the federal level. In fact, they've become more resolved. And actually, there are lots of groups now who want to try to assist us in helping the curriculum get an even wider reach. I'm not worried about that.
All right.
And I'll just add this little bit. I think that this threat, which I consider a gag order, partly because, this work is so profoundly transformative that it is shaping a whole new generation. I was not surprised at all that the gag order happened and that it was targeting education, because the one group that particularly of white Americans that aren't as susceptible to the scapegoating are those who have been college educated, in part because some of this information is there. So the idea to take it into pre-K, through 12th grade is a brilliant way of expanding access to the truth about the American society, and it's exactly why he and others are going after it. One of the things that I did learn just yesterday is that parents initially in private schools Some of them are getting onto the bandwagon and basically pressuring their schools not to teach 1619, not to teach anti-racism, not to teach intersectionality, and so on and so forth. So when you raise the cost of doing something, some people may fall out. And that's why everyone needs to be worried about this executive order. It's not just the federal government, it's not just contractors, it's not just higher education, and it's not just vendors. They're trying to reach everybody to do precisely what was done in slavery, to shut down literacy, the capacity to know about what this country is all about. And we've got to fight it with everything we've got.
Yeah, I'm just going to quickly add to that then, because one thing that I do think has been much more successful than Trump's executive order has been the right-wing campaign to discredit the project. Because I think where that's more effective is it has parents and some educators questioning the veracity of what's being taught. So then they're saying, well, it's not that we don't want them to learn about slavery, but we want them to learn the facts about slavery, and this project is not factual. So that has actually been far more concerning to me than what Trump is doing. I think it's crystal clear for a lot of people, but it has been that effort to really attack the credibility of the journalism that has had more of an impact. I've seen some petitions. There's a petition in Beverly Hills Public Schools that some parents have done, and they're citing these right-wing articles that are trying to discredit it as to why it shouldn't be taught.
And just remember, things do get discredited. You know, welfare got discredited, affirmative action got discredited.
Absolutely.
So these lies can actually bring down things incredibly valuable to us. So it's important to fight the lie.
Yes.
Indeed, but you weren't around when affirmative action was being fought. So the two of you weren't around. So let's just be clear. It's a new day. Final question from Gail. You are up, Gail.
First, thank you so much for your contributions to the world. It's very humbling to be part of this. I am a sexual assault prevention educator, and I know what it's like to present content that triggers defensiveness because it challenges people's identities. I wanted to know how you structured the 1619 project as a curriculum that not only challenged identities, but provided space for people to reflect and move forward.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for your work. First, let me say I didn't create the curriculum. I'm a journalist, and I just helped create the journalism, and the Pulitzer Center then turned it into curriculum. But what I hoped that the project would do overall is by building that history in and connecting that history to the present. That to me is what makes the project stand out. It's not just about the past, though it's giving you. So one, we know in America we don't really learn history at all of any type, and certainly don't learn much history about slavery and the 100 years of racial terrorism that followed slavery. So I've always felt it's impossible to talk about where we are today because people don't have enough information about how we got here to truly understand it. But it's also not enough just to say this is what happened in the past. You have to help people draw these connections to the country that they're living in right now. And that to me was the power of what we did. It gave people that foundation upon which to understand their country, but also to directly look at their country and see why it is like it is. Before the coronavirus shut down real life, I was traveling all across the country and speaking to high school students everywhere, from some of the poorest schools in Newark to the Magnet High School in Chicago. And I heard again and again from kids who said they were able to understand their own community. They could look and see all of these things that they saw and they didn't understand. Why does a Black neighborhood look like this? Why does my school look like this? Why, all of these questions they had, and the history they were being taught did not help them understand the country they were living in. And the 1619 Project helped them to make those connections. And the way that I saw so many educators using it was they would have the students then look at something in your community and go research it and find out its own connections. And that to me was really the power. I've always said, one, this is not the only story. This is not the only narrative. It's never been intended to be the narrative. It's been intended to be a supplement and to really, I just want people to question what it is they think they know about their country and how they came to know it. And it is in that questioning that I hope that you will continue to question and continue to want to read and continue to want to learn more. And it is that questioning that leads one to have an openness that many of us don't have. So that's how I structure the project, and that's what the curriculum was largely built off of. Thank you for your question.
Well, I would like to continue this conversation, but we must bring it to an end. I want to thank Professor Kimberlé Crenshaw, great, eminent legal scholar, and to, again, congratulate Nikole Hannah-Jones on her award as a champion of literacy. And this has been a remarkable conversation. I am enormously grateful to you two women for spending this occasion with me and us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
It really meant so much to hear that, that very real question of how to sort of continue with the self-care while doing this work is on everybody's mind, and that nobody has a perfect answer, which again causes me to just strive to seek that answer for myself.
Yeah, similarly, I think something that really struck me in their comments and answers was when she mentioned that other students that she'd spoken to have taken it upon themselves in the classes to do their own research. And this is like a point of inspiration, a jump off point, a place we can all start, not end. And I thought that was a really great way to then take all the advice they gave about how to approach every conversation, where they've learned what they've learned and what they've seen as difficult or easy or collaborative, and then use that for the next generation too.
I would add that it was powerful and moving, and just so inspirational to hear them talk about the changes that need to happen and the shifting of the narrative. Nicole opened with, it is education that leads to liberation, and that stuck with me, that so much power resides in what is taught and what students learn at a very young age. And so
the way that they're able to arm themselves with facts, I just thought it was so amazing, in reference to how do you deal with whatever the haters or people pushing back, and the confidence that she had because she's armed with facts and truth. I just thought all of that was so powerful and inspiring in terms of the role we can play as activists and educators to continue to present the facts and arm ourselves with facts.
And to think about the role that literacy plays in arming yourself with facts, or being able to enter into any conversation and feel like you belong or you have what you need to participate and speak your truth. I think that speaks to the importance of the Literacy Project and arming not only the kids, but the adults in all of our communities with the tools to feel like they are a part of this civic project.